Welcome back to A Considerate Life. Today we're going to respond to Shelly Kagan, or we're going to listen to a portion of a debate that Kagan had with William Lane Craig a number of years ago on whether or not God's existence is necessary for objective morality. I like Kagan's position just because it affords us an opportunity to look at the moral argument, this argument that in order for there to be an objective moral law, there has to be an objective moral lawgiver. And Kagan is going to address that directly, and he's going to give this kind of combination alternative of a Kantian categorical imperative rationality along with a notion of abiding by a social contract. So we're going to look at a portion of his opening statement, and then we're going to skip ahead in the debate to where he fleshes out his idea of a social contract, and he applies it directly to the sort of Nazi atrocities. And that'll give us a little bit more full-bodied understanding of what he means by social contract. So we'll get into the Kagan's part of Kagan's opening argument here.
Here's a rather different objection that might get raised. We have the thought that morality involves commandments. We have the thought that morality involves requirements. We talk about moral laws. So sometimes it's suggested that where there's a commandment, there's got to be a commander. Where there's a law, there's got to be a lawgiver. Where there's a requirement, there's got to be a requirer. Who plays the role of commander, lawgiver, requirer? Well, it's got to be God. And so it turns out if we're really going to have the notion not just of moral reason to behave in this way or that way, but rather moral requirements to behave in one way rather than another way, then we need to appeal to God after all, to be the lawgiver.
Okay, this is a good setup because Kagan does a good job in not mischaracterizing the position that he's going to challenge. This is a good characterization of what a typical Christian theist believes, that there is an objective moral law, and the ground for that oftentimes is considered God's commandments. God has commanded us to act in a certain way. But the one thing that Kagan brings out is a distinction between moral reasons and moral requirements. Moral reasons are I should do X rather than Y. Here are the reasons why I should do X over Y, right? Moral requirements are that not only do I have good reasons to do one thing over another, but also there's an obligation, there's a requirement that I do one thing rather than another. And he's right in that we typically ultimately appeal to the ground of that requirement coming from God. And now Kagan's going to offer an alternative.
This is an argument that's been proposed by various theistic philosophers. Indeed, this very argument's been embraced by some atheistic philosophers who said, talk of moral requirements does presuppose a lawgiver. Now that I no longer believe in God, I believe there are no moral requirements. Now, I'm not myself inclined to go that way. I'm perfectly prepared to talk about moral requirements.
Again, this is why I like Kagan, because he's an atheist, but and he recognizes that for some atheists, they tie this direct connection between the existence of God and the existence of objective moral requirements or obligations. And if God doesn't exist, then man can do as he pleases. And he's not one of these. He's saying there are atheists who think that way, but I'm not among them. I think there are objective moral reasons and requirements, and he's going to sketch what that is. One of the other reasons I like Kagan is that he shows that not all atheists are moral nihilists. He is an atheist who believes in objective moral values, so he'll sketch that out for us.
I think it's a completely appropriate thing to do. In fact, it would be inappropriate, it would be just simply mistaken, full stop, to give up talk about moral requirements So the question I want to push a little bit is it really true that requirements require a requirer? That's a mouthful. And I'm inclined to believe the answer to that is actually no. Let's take an example of a requirement outside the moral domain. I suppose that when we are engaged in reasoning about belief matters, theoretical reasoning, it's a requirement of appropriate reasoning that you not contradict yourself. People sometimes talk about the law of non-contradiction. I take this to be a requirement of rationality, that you not contradict yourself. Now, should we similarly conclude that since there's a requirement, there's a law of non-contradiction, there must be a lawgiver, there must be some cosmic logician who commands us not to contradict ourselves? Doesn't seem to me to be so. I mean, I can imagine that somebody does say that, but I don't myself feel the force of thinking if there's a law of non-contradiction, that is just to say there's a claim that it's just fundamentally irrational to contradict yourself, I don't see any reason to conclude from that there must be some cosmic logician laying down that law. As we might put it, the logic of the word requirement does not actually entail the existence of a requirer. That's at least seems to me the most natural thing to say about the law of non-contradiction. If we want, we can say, I don't think any harm in saying that reason itself requires that you not contradict yourself. And that's fine. I don't have any problem talking that way. That just, of course, doesn't, I mean, it's talking about reason in a somewhat personified fashion, but no harm done as long as we understand there doesn't actually have to be a person who laid down the law of non-contradiction. Well, similarly then, I want to say that with regard to the various moral requirements, we don't need a lawgiver for them to be genuine requirements. If we want, we can say, and in fact, it seems to me a perfectly legitimate thing to say, that reason requires that we act in accordance with reasons. It lays down these various categorical reasons not to harm people, to aid them. And so we can personify reason in that way, but all we just mean, I think, is that there are these compelling, decisive, objective, categorical reasons to behave in certain ways and not behave in other ways, or to reason in various ways. So I myself am skeptical of the claim that commandments require a commander, or requirements require a requirer, or that law requires a lawgiver. Still, some of you may be more sympathetic to that suggestion than I am. Indeed, some of my colleagues are more sympathetic to that suggestion than I am. It's important to bear in mind that although I have the particular views I'm laying down here, it's not as though all non-theistic philosophers think about these issues in exactly the same way. If you brought up four of us, you'd probably get four different stories about how to ground morality in a secular fashion. Some of my colleagues are more sympathetic to the thought that talk of moral requirement really does entail that there be somebody who's commanding us to behave accordingly. And then we might ask, well, if that's so, who could it be besides God? And the answer I want to give on behalf of those of you and my colleagues who are sympathetic to the suggestion, the answer should be all of us. We, the members of the moral community, are the ones who are laying down these requirements. That idea is especially, I think, a natural fit if we accept the contractarian theory that I was sketching, albeit too quickly, sketching in my earlier remarks. If we think of the rules of morality as emerging from this hypothetical session in which we ask ourselves, how shall we behave towards one another? Except we face this question hypothetically in the mode of perfect rationality. What would perfectly rational beings lay down as these rules? But these are rules that nonetheless we are giving to one another.
So this emphasis on rationality and perfect rationality, this is all very Kantian. It comes from Immanuel Kant. And his view is that perfect rationality, or the categorical imperative, the imperative is if I say it's wrong to lie, and I go, well, inherently, it's rational to think that all people should avoid lying. it can be raised to a categorical moral absolute or a moral law. Um, and so what Kagan is doing is he's very much following in the tradition of this sort of Kantian deontology, this ground of obligation or the moral law on these categorical imperatives, which are deliverances of reason or this hypothetical perfect rationality.
Then when somebody, and we enter into these rules freely, because we see that it makes sense for us to reach these agreements. You can see why it would be rational for us to agree to rules requiring telling the truth, laying out, forbidding lying, forbidding murder, and so forth. Then these are rules that we give to one another. And consequently, if somebody breaks those rules, they're not upholding their part of the social contract. And as such, the rest of us who are indeed limiting our behavior in keeping with this agreement, we can appropriately and with due authority turn to the person who's acting immorally and saying, you shouldn't behave that way. You're not keeping up your end of the bargain. So if you think there needs to be somebody who's demanding of us that we act morally, the answer could be, well, there is. Each one of us is demanding of everybody else, and indeed demanding of ourselves as well, that we act morally. So if you think requirements need a requirer, the answer could be, well, here's a requirer. It's the members of the moral community.
Okay, so the members of the moral community. So Kagan has said a lot of things. He's likened the moral law to the law of non-contradiction. And he says, we think there's a law of non-contradiction because we know that reason or rationality has the law of non-contradiction as its basis, but we don't think that there's this cosmic logician that is required for this law to just be the case. And so he says, similarly, the moral law, the law that governs human behavior, also doesn't need some ultimate ground. Well, my response to Kagan would be that originally, if you look in Aristotle's metaphysics, he doesn't define primarily, he doesn't define the law of non-contradiction as a law of logic, but a law of being. He says that something can't exist, it cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. And so the first thing would be to say, well, the law of non-contradiction as a logical law is derivative of the law of non-contradiction as a law of being. And then the question becomes, why does anything exist at all? So I think Kagan's position is an interesting one because it's not sort of this crass moral nihilism that we would normally get on naturalism. It is a way of trying to. It's a way of taking the power of human reason, that is the power that observes or detects objective moral values, and then tries to ground the objectivity in that power itself. Right. So I think Craig is right that Kagan's system ultimately fails in trying to use reason both as the power of perception and as the ground of objectivity. I agree with Kagan that reason is the power by which humans perceive objective moral value. But I think it's false to say that human reason is also the ground, the ultimate ground of the objectivity of those values. But I think natural law gives us a way of answering the question, well, how is it that atheists can be moral? Well, it's because atheists are humans, and humans can perceive the objectivity of moral behavior. Now, if you try and ground that, you can't ground it in the individual, and you can't ground it in the objectivity of reason. Okay, so in the first video in the series, we looked at Christopher Hitchens. In this one, we looked at a philosopher, Shelly Kagan. In the last one, we're going to look at Sean Carroll, who's a physicist. And so we're going to look at a scientist debating William Lane Craig, and specifically a portion of that debate that is related to the fine-tuning argument. So we'll look at Sean Carroll as a physicist. We'll look at his responses to William Lane Craig's use of fine tuning as an argument for Christian theism. And yeah, that's what we'll do next time.